siyensiya at teknolohiya. Alamin sa programang Pinoy Scientist. Tuwing Linggo, alas 5 ng hapon hanggang alas 6 ng gabi. Pinoy Scientist. KBP Best Science and Technology Radio Program. Pinoy Scientist. Dito sa Radyo Agila.
Magandang hapon po, Pilipinas, at welcome po sa ika-6 na episode ng Lakbay Kinabukasan. Ito po ang kauna-unahang programang pangradyo sa bansa na sumusuri ng hinaharap gamit po ang agham, foresight, at mga makabagong pananaw. At ako po, si Dr. Custer Diacaris, ang inyong kabarangay, Pinoy Scientist, at sa hapon ngayon, samahan niyo po kami sa isa na naman pong matalino, makabuluhang paglalakbay kasama ang aking co-host. Isa po siyang tunay na tagapagtaguyod ng futures thinking dito po sa Asia at sa buong mundo, si Professor Sherman Cruz, ang ating Pinoy futurist. Magandang hapon, partner.
Magandang hapon, Custer. Thank you very much. At ako'y nagagalak at makaka-join na naman ngayong hapon ito at pag-uusapan ng iba't ibang usapin tungkol sa siyensya at sa buong mundo at sa ating bansa. Magandang hapon, Custer.
Ayan. At nakikita na natin sa ating screen si Mr. or Dr. Brock Hinsman. Mr. Brock Hinsman. But he's a pioneer in futures research. He's lived his life and helped Silicon Valley innovation story for over 4 decades. Prof. Sherman, can you please give us a brief introduction about Mr. Brock or Brock?
Yes. Of course, I've known the work of Brock and as a colleague with the Millennium Project.
Mm-hmm.
So the Millennium Project is a global think tank that has been there in the last probably almost 2 decades, Brock, or more. And Brock is actually like the chair of the Millennium Project Philippine Nod. Yeah. Good afternoon and good morning to you, Brock, as well. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I'm sorry we tried this a month ago, and I made a mistake and kind of screwed up the time difference. But hopefully it's worth the wait, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation.
Okay, so now we can start our discussion on, our topic will be about futures, foresight, culture in Silicon Valley, amongst many others. So, Prof. Sherman, maybe you can start the ball rolling.
Yeah. I've been always curious about this, Brock, and I would like to hear your perspective on this. And of course, we all know, probably since time immemorial, not necessarily time immemorial, but around 1980s. To the 1990s, especially so around the 2000s, when I was probably in college, I've been hearing about Silicon Valley, prompting, making some provocation, and eventually probably curated the global narrative about suddenly technology becoming the core of modern enterprise. And my question probably is, I would like to take your perspective on this, is that how did Silicon Valley eventually, would emerge as the epicenter for tech innovation? Was it by accident or design? If you can give us your thoughts about, some probably history about Silicon Valley, and then perhaps your, perspective on how futures and eventually, technology innovation, would blend in the process.
Well, in answer to your question, it was largely by accident. For a long time, Silicon Valley was actually known as the Valley of the Heart's Delight. It was an agricultural area from the late 1800s until really into the 1960s. It was partly by accident, but maybe partly by design. There was a desire to have something like the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the western states of the U.S. So there was an effort to form an MIT of the West at Stanford University, and this became the Stanford Research Institute in the 1940s, and by and so there were some technological developments. The government was spending money on computer technology and this kind of thing in various parts of the United States, but it became kind of a center for transistor technology in California, in Silicon Valley, before it was called Silicon Valley, obviously, only sort of by chance. The person who had started one of the early transistor companies happened to move here because his mother lived here, and she needed his help, and so he moved his company here, and that started the whole sort of semiconductor part of it that was being mixed in with a lot of other technologies that were coming out of Stanford and this kind of thing. So in the course of forming the Stanford Research Institute, there was a desire to fill a need for thinking in strategic thinking, long-range strategic thinking on the part of corporations, because the technologies were here. We were giving companies advice about technology, and they thought, well, so how do we plan for these new technologies? So they're also evolved at the same time that the silicon industry was evolving, this thinking about how to do strategic planning. So not only SRI was formed, but also the Institute for the Future, and eventually Xerox formed its Palo Alto Research Center, PARC. And so these things began to evolve at the same time. The notion that technology was changing, and also the need to sort of plan for the future in some way for these new technologies. And this really took a sort of an inflection point in the late 1960s when we had something at Stanford called the mother of all demos, where we demonstrated that networking computers could be used to increase communication among people and collective intelligence. And so this, with the forming of the internet then in 1969, then this really changed the trajectory. So everything at first was just sort of hardware, design things, and maybe we could use these chips for computing and this kind of thing, along with this other sort of thinking about how to use computers in a different way than we had thought about it before. So all of a sudden, it wasn't just computing, it was communicating. And then it became a much different kind of thing. There was also another coincidence, was that there was a downturn in the market in aerospace in the late 1960s. And the aerospace companies began laying off all of their engineers. So all of a sudden, these computer chip companies had a lot of very low-cost, experienced engineers that they could hire to develop their products. And so that was another kind of coincidence that happened. It wasn't planned. It was more of an accident that these things all happened sort of at the same time. And and then the other factor was that Intel was founded with the help of a banker in New York, or in the East Coast. And this was sort of the birth of something called venture capital, which is now, last year, venture capital was, in Silicon Valley alone, was $90 billion. So think about that. I mean, back in the 70s and 80s, it was, barely a few hundred million, perhaps. So this was another aspect of this ecosystem, as we call it, of technology developments, networking, engineering, and venture capital that all sort of happened at the same time by coincidence. And the rest is history, I guess. But now it's become so influential, maybe too influential, as we've seen all of these investments in artificial intelligence and social media and all these things that have come about in the last 10, 15, 20 years that have created a kind of maybe undue influence by Silicon Valley. Nonetheless, everyone's trying to copy it. Everyone wants that formula. I've been asked very often by government agencies in other countries, well, where's the plan? Well, there was no plan. So it's if you want to copy it, you have to start with your own resources and figure out what are your strengths and how are you going to take advantage of your own competitive advantages. You can't just copy it. There's no formula. You can't just copy it. So, like I said, this analysis of what happened in the past and what's going to happen in the future, we've done a lot of thinking about that in Silicon Valley, but also, as Sherman alluded, the Millennium Project is an international think tank there are lots of people thinking about the future in very different ways and from their own perspectives. So I've been really fortunate to be involved with some of the early thinking on strategic thinking and foresight, but it's not it's something anyone could do. So it's kind of fun now to network with our colleagues all around the world and all these nodes of the Millennium Project.
Okay, Brock, you mentioned about the decade-long evolution of Silicon Valley in a very short period, but I was wondering about the mindset of the entrepreneurs during that time that, turned these wild ideas into world-changing companies. Can you give us a commentary on the culture and the mindset of the people in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, early on, I think it was I guess Apple Computer is one company that people like to focus on, where they really wanted to change the world. There were people here. They weren't thinking about getting rich so much as they were making a difference and enjoying what they were doing and solving problems, engineering problems, but also solving problems for people. And I think that is a cue also as to what you might be thinking about in the Philippines. That this enthusiasm for solving problems for people and having fun and doing something different is really part of that culture. Of course, we have nice weather here, but people at startup companies tend to work 100-hour weeks. So I don't know if they really have much time to go out surfing, but that was sort of part of the culture. There was a lot of networking. There was a lot of people who started companies that failed, who then went on to other companies. People were switching back and forth between companies, which is something that did not happen on the East Coast of the United States. People went to work for a company, a big company, and you stayed with that company. You didn't switch around. You didn't talk to people at other companies. Intellectual property was considered private, and there wasn't a lot of so much sharing of information. This culture in Silicon Valley was much different. People were moving back and forth. They were sharing information. They were starting new companies. And this led to a kind of, like I said, a culture, an ecosystem of starting up companies constantly and failing and starting and trying again, doing over and over and over again. The other thing that was different on the capital side was how the people who started these companies were given equity in the companies. This is something that is not understood well, even in European countries that have tried to promote this kind of thinking. The people who have money want to get all of the equity back and all the profit back to themselves. Whereas the culture in Silicon Valley was you had a way of for the employees to gain equity in the company. And if the company really succeeded and they got rich, they'd go form their own new companies, or they would become venture capitalists themselves and fund new companies. So this idea of equity sharing was also a little bit different than what we had seen in banking and finance in the past. So that's another thing. And I don't know how you're dealing with that in the Philippines, but it seems to me that that's something to think about when you're trying to encourage startup companies is, how do those companies give back and build the ecosystem in the Philippines? And there are a lot of Philippine companies that have been formed. I just attended something the other day. It was kind of a Philippines artificial intelligence summit. And I got to hear about several companies that were different in a lot of ways, partly because they focused on the needs for people in the Philippines rather than trying to be, start a new Apple or a new Intel or something. They really have focused on the needs of people that they understand and that they know, and those applications, once they're successful, actually then have some application, perhaps globally, not just in the Philippines. So I think that you're seeing the beginnings of that kind of Silicon Valley culture in the Philippines with a Philippines accent to it. So I find that fascinating myself to see how that evolves.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, with that, you just, brought to us the idea of, community as the center of the core that many of probably our startup initiatives, are shaped and curated. But, it's pretty interesting to, when you were explaining how, Silicon Valley would later on and today, in fact, emerge as, the core a valley or geography in the world when it comes to global tech and innovation, because you started with, of course, computing, and then of course you computing, and then communicating is an essential dimension of tech enterprises, and of course capital. And then you mentioned that you just can't copy, right? Like, yeah. And then
Yeah.
of course collaboration and collective intelligence as probably the 5 to 6 C's of Silicon Valley history. But then my question is, given the fact that you mentioned the country as well, let's just say developing world or developing countries, particularly is the idea of scaling it up, right? Like there are many startup initiatives, and then ideas, innovation. But then, the hardest part to probably, or mountain to climb, the valley to climb, is to scale things up, right? Do you have probably like 3 or 4 things in mind that are compelling when it comes to, that you think are compelling that startup must do to scale up at the global stage?
Yeah. I think I think a lot of these things don't start out global in thinking. They start out by solving a problem that people have. Uh, and this is there are a couple of different aspects to it. One is if you're designing a new product uh, for an application that is traditional in people's lives, that goes back hundreds of years, let's say. Let's say you're designing something for the kitchen or cooking. That needs to be designed with a local flavor, okay? Because those kinds of traditional activities, have a lot of cultural history to them, and you need to sort of customize it for that location, that country. Whereas if it's a new activity, let's say mobile phones, um, or something like that, then you can have a more global generic design more quickly. The other thing is if it fits on a platform that already exists globally, that's a lot easier. And actually, a lot of what happens in Silicon Valley happens. Uh, there's a lot of interest in new trends, but if you look at where the venture capital has gone historically, it's a chip design. Okay, so we can already, if you redesign the chip, that can automatically go into global production, right? So when NVIDIA came along with a new gaming chip, it was just a chip, right? It processed the information in a different way, but that became immediately manufacturable globally. You could take that design, you could put it into the existing fabs, and instantly you have a global market. Or a lot of software things, networking things. These are things that are easy to scale up globally when you come up with a new design. But if you have to establish a whole new manufacturing and distribution infrastructure for the technology, that's a lot harder to do, and it takes a lot longer to do. So if you come up with a new type of solar cell, today that would be easy to go global relative, but when those things were first being introduced, it took a long time. Or windmills, or all these alternative energy products. If you have to establish a whole new infrastructure, that takes a lot longer to scale globally. And venture capitalists are less likely to be interested in that because the uncertainty of the longer time frame is the net present value in a traditional financial thinking is a lot harder to reach if you're 10 or 12 years out rather than rather than 3 or 4 years. So that's part of the thinking into the other thing is how complex is the technology. So artificial intelligence has taken a long time because there are many sub technologies that had to be invented first, or nanotechnology, these big technology concepts, biotechnology, synthetic biology, these kinds of things. They have many technology steps that have to be invented, weak points that have to be bridged. So a lot of startup companies think they have the best new technology for something, but they don't realize that there are other steps along the way, and so they fail. They run into problems right away and need to bridge those gaps before they can finally succeed. They don't think about that. And the other thing is they tend not to do very good market research to find out if anybody really wants what they are offering. And so that's you have to understand who the customers are and how many of them there are, and whether they're willing to pay for that, or they're willing to say, I have to have that. And that requires listening to your early customers. So you introduce the product, you prototype it, you introduce it as quickly as you can, and get as much customer feedback as quickly as you can so that you understand whether you have something that's going to scale or whether you have to rethink, pull back, rethink, redesign, and then make the changes that will be acceptable to a wider market. So those are 3 or 4 things. I probably kind of confused them all, but if if you list those up, that's a lot of what you have to do to reach scale. So
I find it for scientists like myself. I mean, I'm also an innovator, but I would understand that scientists wouldn't do a lot of market research. They wouldn't do this type of systems thinking on what the other technologies are needed to launch successful product, launch
Right,
fast and iterate quickly. That's the motto in innovation. But
right.
I just wonder, um, now let's go to the futures thinking and horizon scanning. These scientists who will be establishing early startups would need to integrate foresight in their product development and strategic planning. So, in Silicon Valley, how did the scientists do this?
Uh, they don't. I
Oh,
mean, they, I think the best way to think about it is to make sure that you have a good team,
mm-hmm,
so that you have somebody who's a visionary who has the big idea, someone who can execute, either an engineer or somebody who produces the product or service that actually makes it happen. They have the technical skill to make it happen. And you have to have somebody who's a marketer, a salesperson, a person that understands uh, how to sell something. And those skills have to be together in the team so that you understand how to get that feedback and put that into your product design, how to pivot, to know when you have to pivot and change what you're doing and deal with these problems that you're inevitably going to have. Being at SRI for as long as I saw a lot of technologies that took 20 years or more to come out of SRI's laboratories and into the commercial marketplace. So let's say Siri is one that probably most people know. So Siri was an SRI invention. So, but that it goes back way back to the early 1980s when SRI was working on speech recognition technology for the Defense Department. Okay. So it started out as, the Defense Department wanted to have a speech recognition technology.
mm-hmm,
And SRI had the best, as it turned out, had the best technology for that. But it took another guy coming later who was working on a different technology for software agents. And so they were able to put that together in the early 1990s. And then eventually that became a combined product that eventually became something called Siri, which SRI then sold to Apple. Um, I don't think anybody really planned strategically as to how that would roll out over those 20, 25 years that it took for that to happen. But they did keep iterating, like I said, back, adding all these technologies. So there was something else that you said that reminded me of. So the planning part of it, um, I don't think the thing in Silicon Valley is that they don't really plan. They say the best way to predict the future is to invent it. So a lot of the thinking in Silicon Valley is we don't do scenarios, we don't do strategic planning in that sense. We don't do forecasting. We just say we're going to do it. We're going to invent it. We're inventing the future, and we're going to change the future. So the notion of strategic planning um, and foresight is actually not that strong in Silicon Valley. That's what the rest of us do. When we look at what these companies are doing and we say, well, how might that change the future? And then we advise our clients to say, okay, you need to be planning for the future because it's just changed. Uh, so it's not analyzing the trends to try and project a straight line. It's recognizing when something has gone off that straight line and is going in a different direction. And that's how we help our corporate clients and government clients uh, analyze the future and try to predict what might happen next and plan for it, to develop strategies for dealing with alternative scenarios, whether it goes one way or the other. So I would say that the tech companies themselves, the startup companies, don't do strategic planning in that sense. They just do. And the rest of us are left to try and figure out what that might mean.
I'm sure, Sherman, you'll have another a follow-up question on this because that's your specialty on strategic foresight, and we didn't get the answer that we wanted. But so we're just gonna have a brief pause. Ang oras po natin ngayon ay 30 minuto makalipas sa 5 ng hapon, Philippine Standard Time. Magbabalik po ang Pinoy Scientist.
EBC, Eagle Broadcasting Corporation. Ito ang Radyo Agila.
Checkpoint 1062 sa presinto may takas. Pero sa checkpoint, walang alpas. Checkpoint 1062, mga balitang pumapagaspas. Sa checkpoint 1062, walang alpas. Tuwing Linggo, alas 7 ng gabi. Dito lang sa Radyo Agila.
Kalusugan ay ingatan, sakit ay iwasan. Isang paalala mula sa programang Health Watch. Linggo, alas 9 hanggang alas 10 na umaga. Dito lang sa Radyo Agila.
Ayan po, tayo po ay nagbabalik dito lang po sa Pinoy Scientist at kasama natin si Ginoong Brock Hinsman ng Silicon Valley na kanina ay nagbigay ng napakaganda at komprehensibong pananaw tungkol sa pag-iisip ng mga tao sa Silicon Valley. And Prof. Sherman, what's your question? What's your comment about it?
Yeah,
I was thinking
it is,
Silicon
right?
Valley is all about planning. I mean, that was a shock.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to bring that to you, right? Yeah. So Brock, given the fact that you mentioned this, right? In fact, it's really like revealing and insightful, that when you make and invent things, you don't really plan for it because many of eventually, the greatest designs and inventions of the world in many of the biographies or histories of these technologies that, of course, it's through experimentation, you're able to derive something out of that by accident or probably by design as well, because we talked about design, that's wherein you put some, a process into it and some elements that you need to integrate, probably, in creating the blueprint. But then you've also said that, probably it's because it's really putting about a team of people, right? Like with different backgrounds and with different, forms and types of intelligence, right? So, with that in mind, and continuing the question by Castor about futures research, what makes it interesting, right? Like for Silicon Valley, probably like to invest on it and integrate the knowledge that you get, from futures research, given the fact that you mentioned about, Stanford Research Institute and the things that you do.
So what's the question? I wasn't.
Yeah, what makes it interesting for people to actually like listen in this kinds of stuff like futures and foresight?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think the people who do futures research, one, have to be interested in everything, and they have to have an open mind about what the possibilities are, and not be too rigid in their thinking. So when we do horizon scanning, for instance, we're looking at not just the technology development. Certainly that is what often drives possible futures, but we're also interested in the business models, how that might change to fund to invest the time and money into something new, and how those models might change. And that is what then creates plausible futures. So something may sound great technologically. It may be technologically possible, but is someone actually going to invest in it? And how might that change the way they invest in it? So then we go from possible futures to plausible futures. And part of that is analyzing who wants this technology, who's willing to pay for it. And then we start talking about preferable futures. So when we do foresight and futures research, we often intermingle possible, plausible, and preferable futures, and we need to sort of think about those things separately, but then recombine them to say, okay, how do these factors all multiply together to come up with probable futures? And so we, instead of intermingling all those terms, we need to think about them a little bit differently and separate them out, measure them separately, and then recombine them into scenarios for the future. Now, I don't know if that's clear, but the problem that I see with a lot of forecasts for things like exponential technologies and the singularity and these kinds of things is that people say, well, it's possible. And, I want it. So it must be that everybody wants the same thing. Well, they don't, we find out. And so these kinds of wishful thinking leads to a probability of adding probabilities rather than multiplying probabilities. So mathematically speaking, you can't have a probability greater than 1, right? So you can't add probabilities, you need to multiply. So what's the probability of a possible future multiplied times the probability of a plausible future multiplied times the probability of preferred futures. And then you get something less than 1. And so how do those things multiply together to give you the probability that something's going to happen in the future? And so you have to break these things down again, like I said. And that's what a lot of people who call themselves futurists don't do. They have an ideal future that they want, and they think everybody else will want it, and that if there's any possibility that might happen, they say the probability is 1, and that's going to be the future. And so they make predictions about the future that turn out to be not very accurate and will take a lot longer than they think they're going to happen. So that's why we get people who are futurists who have, for 40 years, 50 years have been predicting the future of artificial intelligence, but it's taken this long to get to this next step, which is growing very rapidly, but it's taken a lot longer than they said. Fusion technology is another one where we've been predicting this ideal future with fusion technology will solve all of our energy problems for 50, 60 years, whatever. Quantum computing is another current one that looks very interesting, but it has a lot of problems. And people have sort of just said, well, we're going to do it, and have even recently made some announcements about breakthroughs in technology that are highly questionable. We've had a lot of discussions about artificial general intelligence, AGI, as opposed to generative AI, which is a sort of a specialized form of artificial narrow intelligence, as we say, so domain-specific kinds of things. Well, if you listen to the people who are promoting artificial general intelligence, they all have different definitions of what that is. and therefore they have very different timelines for how long that will take to evolve. And so the futurists don't necessarily pick up on these subtleties. They just launch right into saying this is going to happen, and it's going to happen next year or in 10 years, and they are ignoring all these other internalities and externalities that they haven't thought about very carefully. So the term futurist itself goes back 100 years or more, to people in the early part of the 1900s who were predicting that a whole bunch of new technologies that were coming along were going to change the future drastically. And they said, we need to accept these technologies and we need to do it quickly. And so they were promoting this in their art that they were producing and in publications that were coming out in magazines and things. And unfortunately, this was also then picked up by politicians who wanted to change things quickly. And for better or worse, that became a political movement known as fascism. And that unfortunately had some really bad results when they relied on these kinds of predictions of futurists that didn't turn out to very well. So that's kind of my take on the difference between people who are futurists and people who do futures research. And I don't I don't know how Sherman feels about that, but that's a distinction I try to make all the time.
Oh, question for you, Sherman. So, a futures thinking or a futures researcher is also in the quantitative domain. It's not just qualitative, from what I get from Rob. Is that correct, Sherman?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Oh,
Of
okay.
course. Yep. In fact, I've had a conversation with a futurist whom I admire several years ago, and then one of those probably, emerging aspect on how, futures as a practice or probably discipline would be in terms of, impact getting stronger along the process is the emergence of the quantitative futurist. Right. And particularly when it comes to technology, right? Like I know someone, Brock probably met her in Dubai. Her name is Amy Webb, and she refers to herself as a quantitative futurist,
Oh,
right?
wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then she writes a lot about technology, right? From synthetic biology to artificial intelligence, and of course, based on research, mostly, that she's been doing, particularly, trying to look into how, a researcher, and those who are in fact, developing technology, talking to people are actually making it. And, and then presenting us way on how they actually see the world, those who are inventing these things. So it's pretty quite interesting to see how quantitative futurism works.
Yeah, and that brings me to the question for Brock, because you worked in 3D printing, you had your personal factory concept a long time ago, and you've seen how disruptive technologies were scaled. So based on the idea of a quantitative future, so what signals and what numbers should founders watch out for to understand or predict or get to understand the possible, preferable, plausible next big wave?
Yeah, the thing I find interesting about Amy Webb's work is that she criticizes a lot of futures research for not producing quantitative forecasts. So if you do a scenarios project, she argues that you need to produce numbers to say this is our goal, and this is how we have to measure ourselves against success. Are we achieving those goals or not? And if you don't do a foresight, if you don't do a scenarios project that has measurable future forecast, then you don't know whether you're getting there or not. Are you making progress toward one scenario or the other? How do you measure that? And so if you just have this vague notion of the future, it's very difficult to know whether you're making progress or not. And so I enjoy her criticism, I guess, to say, yeah, this is you need to have some sort of results. Now this is now the way venture capitalists ask for that at the time of a startup is they want some estimate of how many customers are there that have to have this, and how much money are you going to need to achieve that goal within a certain period of time. So they'll ask you for milestones of what you're going to do when and how much money that's going to take, how many people that's going to take to achieve that over a certain period of time, a foreseeable amount of time. So that might be 4 or 5 years. In some cases, it might be 8 or 9 or 10 years. And if you keep meeting your milestones, they'll keep funding you, even with longer term forecasts. So I think that's an important point to make, is that, what are the measurable results? I think looking back on the history of the internet, for instance, we had this notion in 1969 that people would communicate, but it was kind of a limited number of people. It was it was a government program. You had scientists who had actually had desktop workstations that they could use to communicate. When I first started at SRI 10 years after that, I still didn't have that on my desktop. I had a shared terminal, and you had to be an expert on how the terminal operated. There were little toggle switches and stuff. So I said, this electronic mail thing is bogus. I'm going back to using the telex, where I can, type it out and give it to somebody and they can send it. And then the next day I'll get an answer back, from somebody in Tokyo or Britain or whatever. So it wasn't until we all had computers on our desktops that even we started using email regularly. And that all through the 80s, that gradually became personal computers in people's homes, and the number of servers began to climb. And so you could see those numbers going up. And then something else had to happen. You had to make it easier for people to do that. And that came out of another technology that had to be invented, which we now refer to as the World Wide Web. So this interface technology had to make it easier, and then the numbers expanded even faster. So I don't know if you could have planned that in 1969. You might have started to be able to plan that in 1984, 85, somewhere in there. But you would have said, well, we need to make this easier. And then, so these things, I guess now you could look at another new technology and say, okay, now we know we need to plan for these numbers over a certain period of time, and how long is it going to take to reach those numbers? At the time, we didn't really make good forecasts about numbers. We did make some interesting forecasts about how people were going to use that technology. So in the early 80s, for instance, we made a lot of foresight comments about the future use of artificial intelligence. So we could foresee what some of the problems were going to be, and we commented on those. In the late 80s, we made a lot of comments about electronic commerce and how people would use it, and for better or worse. So you can do some of that, but it's difficult to do. But we now know that you should do that if you're going to make a responsible forecast. But as I said, people who are inventing the technology don't necessarily do that. That's for people like Sherman and myself to try to figure out, okay, what are the numbers we need to generate to make a good forecast?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting take, about those things. And in fact, there's this event in the U.S. I think people are, in fact, many globally are attending this event. It's called the X South by Southwest, right?
Oh,
Broadway,
yeah.
right? It's pretty quite, the in thing in the U.S. right now. And I've met several people who, in fact, went there, haven't been there in those events. Is that what I'm seeing is that this, I would link this to my later question about the future of Silicon Valley as well, is that of course, there are many cities that could pose some sort of a real, competition when it comes to Silicon Valley innovation and scaling up at the global level, like for example, Dubai, right? And then you also have in China, and probably not necessarily Japan, but could be in South Korea as well. And Africa is also emerging as a geography for technological innovation. Not necessarily technological, it could be a combination of socio-economic tech innovation. And the comment was that in those events is that they felt that it was just a marketing event, right? That there hasn't really been a deep conversation about innovation and its implication towards the future, unlike for example the Dubai Future Forum, that they felt it was just a marketing ploy among other things. Now my question is, Brock, if these are the kind of narratives that we've been hearing when it comes to events in the US about technology, futures, and knowledge, and probably, of course, in the context of products and services, which is marketing is in fact actually embedded into that. Is Silicon Valley losing its edge? Has it lost its edge, or are there signs wherein Silicon Valley is losing its edge? I don't know. What do you think about it?
Well, the I would say last year, well, it happens periodically that we have these questions about whether Silicon Valley is losing its edge. We actually had a project in the early 80s called Joint Venture Silicon Valley. So this is 40 years ago. And the feeling then was that Silicon Valley was losing its edge. People were panicking. What do we do? How do we keep this going? And obviously, somehow it kept going. Last year, like I said, $90 billion of venture capital came through Silicon Valley. That's over half of all of the venture capital invested in the United States in that year. Usually it's not quite that high a percentage. Usually it varies from year to year, anywhere from like 25% to 40%. Over 50% is actually pretty unusual, but also that was in some big funds, and a lot of it in AI. So so last year may have been a bit of an anomaly. Certainly other states try to draw things away. So in Texas, you mentioned South by Southwest. So Austin has obviously drawn a lot of entrepreneurs away from Silicon Valley and some money, and also some big companies are moving to Texas. So we've seen some of that. I did a project about 20 years ago, 25 years ago for BMW, the car company. So they were interested in, besides Silicon Valley, where are the other centers of excellence in innovation and creativity and design? And we came up with probably 50 cities around the world where there was some indication that they were centers of excellence in creativity and innovation. Unfortunately, I don't think Manila was on the list, but certainly there are many places in the world where you have this combination of creativity, innovation. We're very interested in some of the things coming out of Africa, for instance. And like I said, on Friday, I was very interested to see these Filipino startup companies that had these great ideas, great products, and apparently are developing, what is it? PhilDev is an organization that promotes Filipino entrepreneurs and innovation. And so there's an ecosystem there. I would now put the Philippines on that list, just because of what I saw on Friday, that there's a lot of interest in these things. There's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of energy. There's a different way of thinking about innovation and how to apply these technologies. And that's what we're looking for. I think that we have to look for those emerging centers of creativity, and the venture capitalists will eventually go out to these places and they have to be on the ground. So it's happened in India. It's happened, look at China. China is, the government is actively promoting these centers of excellence particularly in high tech areas. Um, so, but other places have tried it and failed. So Russia, for instance, tried to create a center for creativity near Moscow, and it hasn't worked very well because they tried to control it. They would go in and strong arm the startup companies to the point that they started leaving Russia to go to other countries. Unfortunately, Ukraine was one of those places where a lot of these startups went. Japan has had a problem with this as well. They tried to isolate the creative people and push them over into scuba and say, okay, you innovate, you creative people, you go over here and you stay there and you be creative over there. And then maybe we'll give you some money. But it hasn't worked very well. It hasn't been that successful. So the thing that the reason Silicon Valley has not lost its edge is because it's maintained this sense of freedom and creativity and innovation and design. I think this is a factor that we kind of left out of the discussion. The industrial design community that came to Silicon Valley in the late 70s, early 80s, that also changed the way these products were designed, that changed the way you thought about the customer. So this notion of design thinking has evolved. It's not clear that that's fully formed, but this is another aspect of how do you think about the customer? How do you think about their life and their lifestyle and how these new technologies fit into their lifestyle? And so this is where a lot of centers of innovation and creativity that we were looking for BMW, this was part of the basis is, what are the designers like in that area? How are they being creative and innovation and thinking about people's lives? And again, this is what I saw this last week with these Filipino startup companies, is that they're very focused on the customer and the user. And so it's not that Silicon Valley is losing its edge, I think, so much as that other areas are learning the formula and practicing it.
That's
So
nice to hear, Brock. By the way, I also worked in Tsukuba for 6 years. It's like it's a fantastic place to do research. In any case, Brock, we only have 2 more minutes left, so
okay.
we're really enjoying this conversation. But thank you very much for guesting on our show. But before that, Prof. Sherman, could you give us before we officially close the program, can you share some of your final thoughts about this
Yeah, yes,
episode?
it's a very nice thing, to hear that from Brock, because he just painted for us, some origins about, Silicon Valley, and then how it would evolve. What are the mechanisms and variables or forces of change that are needed to be there in order for you to scale it up? And I think what what the insight probably there is that you need to provide some ecosystem for people to be creative and just do it. And I think interference of any kind, but probably of course support, is essential in order for it to grow, to be nurtured, and eventually scale up. And I think the customer feedback is also very important, because many of the research is currently probably perhaps funded by the government is not really focused on from a customer's point of view. They just need to build and ideate, and that's it, right? And probably the failure to make it work as far as the market is concerned is that particular blind spot, because governments are projects are not necessarily profit or revenue generation driven, right? But then I think the support is very important, and as far as the Philippines is concerned, there's been a lot of initiative being undertaken by the Department of Science and Technology to help our investor commercialize things. But then I think the government needs to look it from the lens of how do you actually make it work as far as markets
Yes.
are taken in the context, which is of course essentially critical and crucial, and how these contracts are made between the scientists, the university, and the
That's
government.
correct, Professor
Yeah, it could be
Professor
an
Sherman.
amplifier, it could be a barrier as well.
Yes.
And thank you very much, Brock, for sharing those perspectives and thoughts.
I hope it's useful, and thank you for inviting me. I'm glad we finally got together.
Finally, yes. And the future of innovation in our country doesn't have to look like Silicon Valley or California. It has to be, what I learned from you is, it has to be grounded to local needs. And it
Yes.
has to be scaled through collaboration and shared purpose. And with that, magkita-kita na naman po tayo sa susunod na linggo dito lang po sa programa na kung saan ang siyensya ay buhay. Maraming salamat po.